Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's Young Leaders Circle event. I'm excited to be joined today by someone who needs very little introduction. Megyn Kelly spent more than a decade at Fox News, including 5 years as the host of The Kelly File. She then moved over to NBC, where she hosted Megyn Kelly Today. Most recently, she's founded the independent production company Devil May Care Media, which produces her excellent new podcast, The Megyn Kelly Show, which is already making waves. Along the way, Megyn has been one of the most prominent people in American television journalism and has been at the heart of some of the most important stories of our time. Today, she is joining me to talk about the rise of independent media, the spread of cancel culture, and how we can have more honest, engaging, and thoughtful political debates. Megyn, it's a great honor to have you. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Raihan.
Megyn, this is a group of young professionals, and so there's going to be a lot of interest in the fact that you were a wildly successful young attorney. You are rocketing towards becoming a partner in your law firm. You kind of had it made, and yet you decided to leave all of that behind and start from scratch in an entirely new career. So what possessed you to do that? What is it that drew you to journalism, a profession that many parents warn their children from ever even considering entering?
Yeah, I might be one of those parents today, but this was back in 2003. I had been practicing law for 9.5 years. I was about to make partner at Jones Day, and I was totally miserable. I was just totally unhappy. The ego boost of being an attorney, I thought like that was going to make people take me seriously. That got me through the first, say, 7 years of legal practice, which was a total grind. And I didn't mind the hard work. It was just acrimonious, nonstop hard work that made you miss everything, weddings, funerals, all of it. And it wasn't until I was, getting a little long in the tooth in my associateship career, and they were dangling the partnership in front of me, that I realized that's a real commitment. Like now if I take that spot, I take it at the expense of someone else. So I was sort of walking around with that layer of guilt on me. And then two things happened. One, I was driving home on the Kennedy Expressway in Chicago, where I was living, at 2 a.m. And I actually considered driving off the highway in an attempt I didn't want to die. I wanted to like break a major bone so that I could be in the hospital or just out of work for a few weeks. And, I was like a femur, couldn't be like a wrist. And no one's going to have sympathy for that. And I thought, wait, okay, so that's crazy talk. That's a good sign. I need to be thinking about doing something else. And then the second thing was I went and I visited my friend, a nurse in Boston. And we had gone to high school together. We were longtime friends, and she didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And we had an amazing time. I was just reminded of how I grew up, what actually matters. She was in this tiny little apartment in Boston, which is an extraordinarily expensive city. We went down to the corner bar. We had dollar beers. We had an amazing time. And I was reminded, I don't need, but I also can't be in a place that will completely take advantage of that, or where I will make myself take advantage of my own work ethic to the point of unhealth.
What is it that the legal training did for you in your early years as a journalist? How is it that it separated you from other people who are getting their start in media?
Well, I do think most lawyers are, I always call us soulless lawyers because we're able to see both sides, and we rarely have a true ideological bent when we approach our cases. That was my experience, that lawyers are literally trained to see both sides. And whenever we were going to trial, the very first thing we would do is we would prepare the other side's case, not our case. And so when you got over to preparing your side, you knew all of the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, forward and backward. And on any given case, and certainly when you did trial team or whatever, a lot of times you wouldn't find out which side you were arguing until you showed up at the mock trial. And on any given case, you could argue the other side. When I was young, I remember saying I could sit in for Hannity or Combs on any night when it was still Hannity and Combs, just because the question is, can you argue it? Do you see the strengths and weaknesses? And so the ability to do that and to be non-ideological then and now, I think, was and is a strength of mine. And just the dogmatic need for facts, like facts, that will rule the day. You can spin them, you can argue them, but you can't avoid them, even in today's day and age. And I'm sad to see them falling by the wayside in favor of ideology these days.
Was that something that you came to very quickly, or was there something that turned? Your interviewing style has been described as prosecutorial. And yet that requires a certain level of fearlessness. And I wonder, when you were first starting as a broadcaster, did you feel the freedom to really not pull your punches and be aggressive? Or was there some turn that happened when you thought, okay, I can do this, I can be a little aggressive, and it's going to be just fine?
Well, I think it's my nature when I'm doing an interview with, a pundit, a politician. It's not like a sympathetic mom of a sailor. I wouldn't be speaking to her like that. But certainly when you put a politician in front of me, he or she's going to get it. And that's because I'm there to represent the audience. I've never seen myself as there to be on this person's side or to promote this person. I'm there for the people watching. But I will say it's almost like a tunnel vision when somebody comes on and I can see them very clearly and they're right in front of me like a boxer in the ring. And I can always see when they're dodging, like they're getting out. And I always saw it as stay where I can see you, stay where I can see you. And so I see my interviews as sometimes I got to head bop them on the side of the ear to get them back where they're supposed to be in front of me in the ring. And just this need to make them, or at least try to answer the question asked, like we had to do in the law. And you can see when somebody's trying to bridge away, and you have to bop them on the side of the head and say, stay where I can see you. So that I had early on and I liked it. But I will say this, I did get reminded early on by Britt Hume, who was my boss in the DC bureau, that when covering stories, I was about to go cover the Duke Lacrosse, what we now know is a fake rape accusation. And I'll be honest, I was young. I wasn't that far out of college. And I was like, they did it. And my first instinct when I heard about those three white guys, one woman, single mom, stripper, who was allegedly taken advantage of at this party, I'm like, they probably did it, derelicts. Wrong, right? Wrong. But if you look back on the coverage of that case, I was one of the only ones who got it right. Now, how did I switch from the person who was like, they did it, to the person who wound up getting it right? Britt Hume pulled me aside before I went down there and said, keep an open mind. And so I was reminded in that instance, very early in my career, to check. It wasn't an ideological bias. It was more, I don't know, male, female, fresh out of college bias. And he knew early on that there were a lot of things playing in that case with that DA who wanted to get reelected and get a higher pension, black, white, rich, poor, all of the things that Durham has, like the town of Durham versus Duke. And it was a very good lesson to learn early on.
There has been this major development. It's hard to put your finger on exactly where it started, but this development in which more and more young journalists, they are willing to be aggressive. They're willing to be tough the way that you've always been throughout your career. The difference is that they are advocates. The difference is that it's very predictable where they're coming from. And if we're going to be sympathetic for a moment, the way that they see it is that both sidesism is wrong. There is truth and there are lies. And I want to be on the side of what is truth, what is true, what is just. And so there's this crusading spirit. And I'm curious, just what do you make of the phenomenon? Because a lot of these people are just like you. They're ambitious. They believe in journalism as a profession. It just so happens that they're trying to use it to move the world in a certain direction.
I don't see anything in common between me and those people. And I don't respect the way they approach this job at all. I do think they're advocates. That's advocacy journalism. And you can own that if you want to say that's what you are, or just show it to the world, which is what they're doing right now. But then don't claim you're a straight news journalist, because you're not. And that's what's undermined the entire profession. I mean, that's why people no longer have faith in the profession, because they're looking in the camera and telling us they're straight shooters, and they're not. And I think 9 times out of 10, the reason they do that is it's because they make it about themselves. They need to virtue signal to an audience. I'm with you. I'm not sexist. I'm not racist. I'm not pro-Trump. I'm a part of the resistance. They may not be saying it explicitly, but they're finding a way to telegraph it because they need affirmation on those things. They've chosen their 90 seconds of airtime to try to make it about themselves. And it's exactly the wrong instinct. It's not about you. It's about the truth and your audience and service of the facts.
What's changed? Why has that become such a dominant mode of building a successful career in media? Is it the audience that's changed? Is it something about the economics of the business? Because it really does seem much more common now than it was 15, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think cable news has played a fair amount, a role in this, that it's a more opinionated venue and people are encouraged to be more confrontational or opinionated. I always felt like you could sort of have a point of view. Like, I know he's not telling me the truth when he says I can keep my plan if I like my plan. I have done my homework and I know it's not true. And I can ask questions of somebody that barely drive toward the truth on an answer, right? On that. But it's not the same as going out there and looking into the camera before we knew it was a lie, because we ultimately did learn Obama was lying. He knew in his head it was a lie. But before that, I never went on the camera and said, he's lying. He's lying. Just like he's lied all these other times. That's a judgment, right? And I think now they get praised for opinions like that, that fall in line with the ideology of the channel they work for or the paper for which they write. It's not shamed. No, there's no Brit Hume pulling them aside saying, keep an open mind. It's to the contrary, it's get him.
You recently interviewed Matt Taibbi on your podcast, and it was a fascinating conversation for any number of reasons. But he was advancing this really interesting hypothesis that basically many people in media right now, in the past, they would have treated powerful institutions, government, large corporations, you name it, adversarially, just doing exactly the kind of journalism that you've always done, holding people's feet to the fire, regardless of where they're coming from. Whereas now, he was suggesting that the thing that's changed is that it's almost as though the journalists see themselves as translators of people in power. They are from similar backgrounds. They went to similar schools. They care about the same things. And it's almost as though they're trying to educate the audience to share the perspective of the person in power. Do you buy that, or do you think there's something important that Taibbi was missing?
No, I think he's right about that. I think too many of the journalists now are making these, big salaries that are dependent on relationships with people like that, and they fall into it. So, like, I'll describe it to you this way. So I loved Chief Justice John Roberts when he was going through his nomination process. I covered his hearings wall to wall. I went down to the Library of Congress. I pulled everything he ever wrote. I read every single opinion he ever wrote in the lower courts. And I thought, this guy was born in the cradle with a little Chief Justice robe. He was meant for this job, and I think he'll be wonderful. And I could see, I am more right-leaning in my approach to the law. I'm definitely more of an originalist, but I have clear eyes when it comes to the liberals too on the courts. And had I been a senator, I would have confirmed Elena Kagan and Sotomayor as well. Anyway, my point is, he got to Washington and he got on the Supreme Court. And my husband Doug has a theory that we should no longer put very good looking people on the Supreme Court, because what happened to Chief Justice John Roberts? I think he started going to all the Georgetown cocktail parties and receiving all the accolades and believing some of the nice things that were written about him in the press when he went with the liberals. And before you knew it, he was one of them, right? It was like, what happened to Chief Justice John Roberts? And I had a funny story with him, just as an aside. I saw him at this event here in New York. It was one of those plays where you walk around. It was at the Irish Embassy, and Melissa Gilbert, who I love from Little House on the Prairie, was starring it. And he was there, and I was there just watching. And it was one of those things where you're part of it. Like, you sit down as an attendee of the dinner with the cast in the middle of the play. Anyway, I saw him afterward, said, I'm a fan still. I'm a fan. And he said, oh, you're the one. And I said, I am. But Obamacare was not a principled decision. It wasn't a principled decision. And my husband was like, honey, I'm like, you're the one who had the Georgetown cocktail party thought. Anyway, so my point is, the same thing happens to journalists. They start to believe their own press, the nice things that are written about, Chris Cuomo or whatever, when he beat somebody up on CNN. And they start rubbing elbows with those people. And, the New York Times comes into their world and in a favorable way. And then they start to need it. And as a journalist, you're in a dangerous place when you need people's approval. You're in a much better place when you are a skeptical curmudgeon. And, people don't really like you that much, but you do your job. Like, your audience likes you, but the people you're interviewing, they have a begrudging respect for you.
So what is it that you need to preserve that independence? Now, one thing that you've done, you're building your own media company from the ground up. And that's one approach to take, that's what's going to allow you to be independent and to be fearless. Another approach could be, is it a failure on the part of editors, for example, mentors within these media institutions for not inculcating those values of independence? Or is it just simply that you just need your own independent platform if you're going to be independent in that way?
I mean, look, I will tell you, I've worked at ABC, NBC, and Fox now, and by far, Fox was the most open-minded to opposing editorial to what was clearly their viewpoint. Fox, there's no question it leans right, but they are very much open and desirous of guests from the other side, and they want the audience presented with the other side. Now, some shows will put on, more of a sort of not that impressive liberal, right? Somebody who's easy to knock down. I never did that. I always wanted the smartest person I could find with the smartest version of the other arguments and then get it on, like debate, let's hear it. So nobody's perfect. I'm not saying anybody is, but I do think given the corporate missions, which is really about money, the corporate missions are about money, not about a public service as a journalist. You really don't have any choice but to go independent if you want truly independent analysis, news presentation, and commentary.
So when you're talking about Fox, there is this belief in the kind of left of center world that essentially Fox has radicalized much of the American public, that basically, Fox has been the kind of marionette puller, the string puller behind the scenes. And there's another view, which is that, well, actually, Fox was serving an unmet market niche, this desire for more balanced news, the desire for more conservative opinion. Tell me what you think about that when you have conversations with people to your left who are saying that, they're trying to control the discourse in this or that way. They are determining political outcomes through their editorial line. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, it always makes me laugh because the conservatives have one channel, one. The liberals have every other channel. I always laughed when they really had this desire to shut down Fox News. It was like, it's not enough for you that you have them all. Conservatives can't have this one. And yes, now Newsmax is rising and there's the other one, but Fox is really the dominant force still, and that's obvious. So it's absurd that there's so much focus on it as like the devil for turning people conservative or like reflecting conservative thought when the liberals have everything. They've got MSNBC, they've got CNN, they've got ABC, NBC. Now CBS is going more left than it was, back in the day. We just talked to Cheryl Atkinson about that in an interview that's going to air this week. Anyway, I don't think Fox caused conservatism. I think Fox gave a voice to it. And I think Roger Ailes understood, as a guy who was a ditch digger in Ohio, what the mindset was there and how it wasn't being reflected anywhere. Fox didn't make people pro-life. Fox just did news stories that didn't present pro-life people as crazy zealots all the time. Fox didn't make people pro-Second Amendment. The country did that, right? Like the people who live as elites on the sort of coasts of the country, they don't get exposed to people who think like that. They do see Fox News. So they think, oh, it's Sean Hannity's fault. Well, that's baloney. Try leaving New York City, leave the Upper West Side, go to Texas, go to Montana, go to the South, see how the heartland lives. It's not like we do up here on the Upper West Side. Thank God.
One thing you've been very critical of, you've been very outspoken about cancel culture, about this idea that we need to deny people platforms because their ideas are too dangerous. You have been willing to have people from a range of different ideological perspectives on your new show, and you've done that throughout your career in journalism. I wonder, do you think that cancel culture is particularly a problem of the left, or do you think it's a more general problem in which you have people who are intolerant of different perspectives?
I think it's a far left problem. I think liberals are on our side. I mean, I'm a registered independent. I'm more center right in my thinking than I am center left, but I got a couple things I'm center left on. And I know almost all my friends up here on the Upper West Side are liberal. All my friends growing up, I come from a family of Democrats, so I know a lot of Democrats and liberals. They're with us. They're not in favor of this nonsense. They don't want to be grouped with the people who are. It's the far left activist woke scolds who need to be dealt with. And unless the rest of us, grow a pair and start standing up, we're going to lose more and more of our culture and our willingness to engage. Protecting the First Amendment right that's everything to me. That's everything to me. That's what we're arguing about on woke culture. Are we going to be able to have the free and open exchange of ideas, or in the press, the free and open exchange of a press? Or are we going to bow to this unseen woke mob that seems to be run by 19-year-old white women here on the Upper West Side that's going to lecture the rest of America on how they need to think, speak, and behave? No. And unless more people stand up and say, no, I'm not going to let you re-racialize the society, I'm not going to let you re-sexualize the society, we're going to go down with them. So it's one of the main reasons I stayed independent. I formed this podcast. And I think more than just people who are on the, the web and on Fox need to fight this battle in order for us to win it.
You also occasionally fought battles with folks on the right who felt that you were being a little bit too fair to people who did not share their convictions. Is that something that you think about as well? Just trying to make sure that a conservative audience is being exposed to other perspectives?
Well, I'll tell you, it was one of my disappointments when I asked Trump that debate question, because I had always felt prior to that moment that Republicans weren't into cancel culture, whatever we had of it prior to then. And then things have changed dramatically in the country over the past couple of years. So I was surprised to see so many diehard Trump fans get so angry and say they were never going to watch me again and so on. But what I realized over the next 9 months when Trump kept after me was it wasn't true. They were mad that that was true, but they weren't actually tuning out because my numbers were actually just going up and up and up. And so I realized then that there's a disconnect between what they're saying and what they're doing. And I actually believe that now, having seen what cancel culture is all about and how ridiculous it is, I think even the diehard Trump fans are beginning to understand, how to prioritize these fights and how, there may be people who irritate you. Even Fox is going through it now, right? That some of the diehard Trump fans are mad that they've decided to call Biden the president-elect, and they say they're leaving Fox, and Newsmax numbers are going up, but Fox is still dominant. It's going to stay dominant because they're expressing anger, but they're not actually leaving. And I think at heart, Republicans don't believe in boycotts.
Cancel culture is one thing when you're talking about media outlets, when you're talking about journalists who are, further along in their careers, but it seems as though we're seeing it really enter our K-12 schools more and more, certainly in a number of major cities. This is something that you've been vocal about. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. When you're thinking about children in K-12 schools, what should we be worried about in terms of a changing ideological climate?
Mm-hmm. This is a huge, huge issue. I talk to so many parents. I've got kids who are in 5th grade, 4th grade, and 1st grade now. And so all of my friends are parents, and they're so worried about this. Even liberals here on the Upper West are saying, I want to be an ally. I want to do what I can to support police reform, to be supportive in when it comes to anti-bullying of trans kids or, whatever the issue is. But I don't want my child indoctrinated into far left social justice warrior type thinking. I don't agree with that, but they're terrified. They are afraid to speak up for many, many reasons. And I do think to a large extent in today's day and age, that fight has to be fought before you enroll your child, because it's really hard to win it once you're already in it. And I'm talking about private schools. We've been in the New York City privates, but think if you're in public school, you don't have another option. You have to go to this school. I mean, unless you want to withdraw and go to religious school, which is a meaningful option. But in terms of public school, you kind of only have the one. And so it's a really tough thing. And yet I do feel it's another area in which we've got to speak up. The only way is to speak up.
What do you think happens to children who are raised in this environment where it's a kind of ideological hothouse, where they're only exposed to one perspective? Do you think that there's a natural tendency of most young people to just tune it out? Or do you fear that you're going to be raising a generation of ideological zombies who just are going to, believe in whatever is, they're going to parrot whatever they're hearing from their teachers?
Well, I used to think that they'd go to college and, they'd go to their safe spaces that we were mocking for many years. Most sane adults were like, oh, Lord, they'll grow out of it. But I don't believe that anymore. Instead of them growing out of it, they've sucked us into it. And there have been it's so ubiquitous on college campuses now that they're winning. And I don't know if they're winning truly in people's hearts and minds, or if just more and more people feel they have no choice but to bow to the mob. Because corporate America is now saying all this stuff. And, Sports is now saying all this stuff, and everywhere you turn, it's always been Hollywood and media are left, but now it seems everywhere you turn, you're getting scolded if you have a heterodox view on some of these dicey social issues. So I do think it's important as a parent to get in there early and at least present the other view. Doug and we're independents, and we've been trying to raise kids. Our kids always ask us, what are we? Are we Democrats or are we Republicans? And we always say, we're independents, and you can make up your own mind once you learn the issues. You'll figure it out. Well, what are the issues? So we try to present both sides of them. And then we'll tell them where we come down. But I always try to say it in a way that's not steering, because I'd love for them to make up their own minds. But what I've realized is I have a school system that's going exactly the opposite way. The other side's not even presented, and there is an attempt to push down one aisle. That's not okay. So unless you start actively counter-programming at home, they almost force you to pick a side and argue it. You're going to wind up with a kid who has totally different views than you do. If you are, if the ideological scale is 1 to 10, and 1 is a far, far lefter and 10 is a far, far righter, you're going to wind up opposed to your kid if you're anything right of a 2. That's not okay.
I wonder, you are one of a number of luminaries in journalism who've been starting your own brands, building your own direct channel to your audience that you control, that no one can really deny you. That can be incredibly powerful, but I also wonder, as you see independent voices who are leaving some of the big media entities, I do worry a bit about what's happening to the younger people in those organizations. When someone like you, who was a mentor to younger people, or also someone like you is just simply showing there's another way to do journalism, I can go down that path. Do you worry about that a bit, where the independent voices are all staking out their own turf, creating their own organizations, and exiting these big media organizations that remain very influential?
Well, to some extent, I think it's Darwinism, it's a necessary process to go through to have, legacy media shed its ranks of people who don't want to do the constant far partisan anger stoking every day, and find people, another ecosystem gets created where you can have more thoughtful, honest discussions. And that's one of the reasons why I love and respect what Joe Rogan's been doing, because even though, I'm not into fighting, mixed martial arts, and I'm not into pot, and I'm not into a lot of what he's into, he's fearless in his approach to discussions, and he's created a real lane over here for people like me who want to have these talks. And honestly, you would not believe the number of people who contact me or my team every day saying, take me with you. Take me with you. They want to get out. And so as I grow the company, I'll go back and get them. But I feel for them, because there aren't that many meaningful outlets on the outside doing journalism. There's a lot of people who are just full swing punditry, and they're partisan. But there's not that many people doing, like, my dream for my company is to get to the point where we hire investigative reporters and we break news and we break stories, and we're more of a news organization with commentary. Not there yet because we're just babies, but I'd love to be part of creating that space.
One neat thing about your podcast is that you are having very in-depth conversations. These episodes are oftentimes an hour and a half long, quite different from cable news, where you had segments that would go viral, where you really went for the jugular. You really got a kernel out of someone in 3-4 minutes, if that. Tell me about the difference in approach when you're going from short form to long form. What is it that you've had to adapt? What is it that's changed most?
Mm-hmm. I used to joke, I have the sense of humor of a 9-year-old boy, but I used to joke that on cable news, you just had to, get right after it with one another. There was no time for cocktails. And, on the podcast, it's time. You can go out to dinner, you can have a couple drinks, you can warm up a little bit. And, it's just so much nicer. You really get to know the other person. And just the emotional journey is so much more fulfilling. I'm finding on the podcast is I don't have a formula, but I would say usually I'll jump into it with a guest on news of the day, so we can talk about what's actually happening in the country. And then you sort of end into, who is this person? Who am I hearing? What is this person's story? And even if you know this person, there's always something new to discuss. And then once you've heard that person's opinions, their backstory becomes more interesting to you. I think you as an audience member will permit it more now that you're interested in the person's POV than if I just put somebody on who they didn't know and started talking about his childhood. That's not that interesting. But it's been working, and the relationship between the listener and the guest builds as it does with me. I'm learning alongside my audience. I'm not their teacher. I'm their co-student. And I don't know. I think when it's done, you have like you let out a sigh of like, wow, I took an emotional journey where I learned, I felt something, not just sometimes outrage, but also maybe some healing, maybe some transcendence. And I want to go back for more. And I hear that all the time. People are like, you don't put out enough episodes. I want one every single day. And I know what they mean. I feel that way about the show, and I feel that way about some other people's shows who I love too. I just think the relationship is more meaningful.
We have a number of questions from our audience. One is from Rav. Megyn, do you have any advice for young contrarian journalists like myself?
Speak up. Go fearlessly into the world, my friend, and be not afraid. You have to do it. People are going to tell you have to bend to their will, right? They're going to pressure you to be more this or be more that. And look, if you have signed up for a partisan organization and you know that's what you're doing, then you made your own bed, you're going to have to lie in it, right? But if you have joined an organization that purports to be independent, then maintain your independence fiercely and push back. And the other thing is, you have to realize in today's day and age, if you are not going to be one of the woke scolds, you are going to get called an ist many times of one sort or another. So you better be able to handle name calling, and nasty name calling. It's not like you're rude. It's like you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a sexist, you're a pig, you're a misogynist, a transphobe, all of it, xenophobe. And the first few times you're on your heels like, oh my God, like my mother's listening to this. After a while, it gets less effective because, when they're calling everyone those words, even Obama now, it gets less effective, but just be prepared if you go into it knowing that's going to happen to you unless you bow to the woke mob. And don't forget, there's no amount of wokeness enough for the woke, because they will turn on you unless you go full-fledged hard left woke. You have to maintain your integrity and get ready, gear up for battle.
I often wonder if the people who are the most aggressive in attacking others are doing it partly because they fear being attacked themselves. And it's almost as though the only way you can prove your bona fides is by going on offense.
Absolutely. But it doesn't work. They'll turn on you just like that if you do that anyway. So it's pointless.
A question from Philip. Some commentators have argued that some of the energy behind cancel culture will fizzle after Trump exits the political stage. In many ways, he embodied the liberal caricature of the ideology. Do you think there's any truth to this?
I don't think so. I think they're dug in on this. I think this has been happening for a long time at the college level and now even younger. And this is getting baked into the cake of too much of humanity. He was not the cause of this problem. He was a symptom of it. He was the first Republican who was really willing to take it on. And no, not in the most genteel way, but you can make a very strong argument that this is not a war to be fought genteelly, right? That's why people, I think, who didn't necessarily love the way Trump was tweeting still backed him very strongly, A, because of a lot of his policies, but B, also because he was willing to fight these fights. What other president would have canceled those critical race theory sessions, which were absurd? And Trump, who's not necessarily the best spokesman for all of his policies, he got on the debate stage, he was like, they're horrible. And he's right. And it's not the best expose of what was actually happening at these sessions, but at least he did it. And of course, what is one of the first things that we've heard Joe Biden's going to bring back? Critical race theory mandated sessions where all the white people are shamed for having a certain pigmentation, and then the people who are people of color get told that they're oppressed. It's like the most racist thing you can do to colleagues who previously 9 times out of 10 were having no problems.
Question from Julia. What does Megyn make of the insurgent left-wing media ecosystem that has developed since Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign? Podcasts like Chapo Trap House come to mind. Do you think they have a sustainable future, or are left-wing news consumers too comfortable with legacy sources?
Well, I think they've created their own, as you put it, ecosystem too, and it's working. That's actually how we first got wind of Tara Reid. She went on one of those podcasts. It was like, oh, okay, because a Bernie supporting journalist was willing to give her a forum. And so I think they have a role the same as more independent minded people like I do. over here. It's not going to be on cable news, and it's not going to be on, the legacy media. ABC, NBC, and CBS are going to be, those are other versions of CNN. So they're not going to want that. They're definitely more Biden leaning than they are Bernie leaning. So I think that's healthy. I love having more and more viewpoints out there. I love like Rising, The Hill's Rising with Crystal Ball. She's a Bernie supporter. But they have both sides represented, right? It's not just the one, but that's good for us. It's better not to have, like, if you want Joe Biden's perspective, you're not going to have to struggle to find it. But if you want to hear Bernie's point of view, you got to work for it. And same for like, well, Trump, or now that the party's been fractured, the more Trump version versus the National Review Republican version. Like, there's got to be a place for all of those voices. And thanks to the internet, we're getting it.
One thing I worry about is the effect that new business models are having. So on the one hand, you look at an institution like the New York Times, which was always left-leaning, let's say, but where it's become more pronounced and more extreme, partly because it's now subscriber-driven. And when you have subscribers, when you create this sense of identity and membership, people are offended to have views that are challenging to their worldview, that are challenging to their perspective. Then on the other hand, you have these organizations where the audience doesn't have that sense of immediacy, that sense of membership, but then those people are so susceptible to their social group, to their peers, that the journalists there are just going to become very, conformist. So I wonder for you, you are not just targeting a single ideological audience. You're trying to get a broad group of people who want honest, challenging conversations. Where are you finding this audience? Kind of what, and how do you build something sustainable on that audience that's not necessarily, that kind of fired up Chapo Trap House, kind of audience? I wonder, do you think there's something there?
I think we've been pushed untruthfully into believing that you must choose a side as a journalist or just a business person wishing to participate in this lane of commerce. I don't think it's true. And the reason I never believed it was when I did the Kelly File on Fox, they have a built-in conservative audience. They do have some independence. But my show, The Kelly File, which was certainly, it was right of center, but it was definitely no Hannity or Laura Ingraham or even Tucker type program. It had the largest, first of all, it was the #1 show in all of cable news in the demo. We overtook O'Reilly, and for the first time ever in the history of the channel. Why did that happen? And we had the largest number of independents watching us of any show in television news. Why did that happen? Because of, I think, how we approach things ideologically. We weren't too far to the right, and we weren't left, but we were getting the center lefties because we were tolerable, and they could check out what somebody who's pretty close but not exactly feels about the news. It's because they want to learn. So I knew from experience that it wasn't true. You couldn't make it with an ideological approach like mine. And trust me, a lot of people tried to tell me, you've got to join a right-wing organization, blah, blah, blah. And I just didn't want to do it. It's not like I have anything against it. Obviously, I worked at Fox News for 13 plus years. It's that I just didn't want that for my next phase. I got out of Fox. I went to another biased place and the other way. And I merged sort of wanting to be free and wanting to have honest conversations. And I'll just tell you, my podcast, we had all sorts of projections, which you have to do to get advertisers and all that. Our podcast is beating every projection tenfold. We've been overwhelmed with the number of subscribers and listeners and downloads and so on. We've only been on for 2 months. There's clearly an appetite for it. Not a day goes by that I don't get called by another journalist or an investor or somebody who wants to like build a new channel around this, or, right now I'm doing my own thing, but I'm sure that, necessity being the mother of all invention, we're going to see more independent minded news options pop up.
We have a few more questions, and I know our time is limited, so I'll move quickly. A question from Amanda. Emmanuel Macron has criticized American media for its coverage of France's challenges assimilating immigrants. Just a few years ago, Macron was a darling of the media, a stark contrast to Trump and an outspoken champion of globalization and cosmopolitanism. What do you make of that? Is that a wake-up call of some kind?
That's a really good question. I just had on Ayaan Hirsi Ali on the pod, who's brilliant. And she's been very bold in talking about some of the problems with Islamists and their unwillingness to assimilate in places like France. And as you point out, a few years ago, even that comment would have been viewed as bigoted. But I think more and more people are starting to understand when you get people beheaded in churches and on the streets in Paris, you kind of have to get honest about what's really happening, that there's truth to that. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's not to paint Muslims with the same brush, but there is a faction that needs to be dealt with in an honest way for the good of the entire society. So I think Macron has come to that realization. And it's a good one. And you see the contrast and compare between him and Justin Trudeau up north of the border. And I mean, I would take Macron every day of the week, and I think most of this country would. I think Francis had to deal with this problem much in the same way America did, where it came right to its door, it knocked on the door, and then it started hurting people. And then one had no choice but to pay attention. I think the question now is what's going to happen in London, because they're having a similar problem without a similar renaissance of thought.
Question from Tony. One formulation of conservative frustration in recent years is that conservatives have a lot of political power, but not cultural power. How should conservatives go about acquiring cultural power? Won't that require making inroads in prestigious institutions, fighting their war in a more genteel way?
That is a brilliant question, and you've hit the nail right on the head. I think Republicans have gotten very good at winning elections. Notwithstanding what happened with Trump in this last election, though he came very close, they're good at winning elections. They've won, most of the last 10 presidential elections. They've done a great job over the past 12 years of taking over state houses and governorships at the state level. They're terrible at the culture wars. They just haven't even been fighting them. And not only are they on the losing end of the balance, they're not represented at all. They're not there at all. Rehan and I talked yesterday, not everyone can send their kid or wants to Hillsdale or Liberty. I appreciate that those institutions are there, but why do conservatives only have two? It's insane. And so you have to agree to let your child be indoctrinated into far left ideology in order to get them a good education. I mean, every once in a while you get somebody who comes through and maintains their conservative bona fides, but why should you be forced into that position? Why should you be forced to look at Black Lives Matter on the court of the NBA when you're just trying to catch a ball game, when you might not believe in that organization, because 80% of Republicans do not, right? Because they've been paying attention to what it is, which is truly a political body that supports Democrats, not Republicans. There's no reason. If the Republicans would start to fight, I think they could make inroads. I think it's going to take years. But I think things like alternative sources are like Parler to Twitter. It's not as big. It's nowhere near as powerful. There aren't as many people on it, so it's not necessarily as attractive, but it's a great idea and it's growing. And the more we water those seeds, the more they will grow and the stronger they'll get. The answer is not just to surrender. And also, the answer is not to be silenced. Speak up. One of the things I saw this past year, and I'm sure you saw it too, is all the Republicans started whispering. They started whispering their real viewpoints as if the left's narrative about them was true, that they really are just awful for not believing what this small percentage was saying, as echoed by the media and Hollywood, etc. Well, it's not true. That's why Trump got 74 million votes. And by the way, many of the millions who voted for Biden are on this team, where they don't want all that stuff shoved down our throat. So speak up, be brave, stand up and say, I refuse to let you do this to me and to my country. And the more you do it, the more somebody else will do it. The more I do it, the more somebody's going to do it behind me. And then we will realize we're not alone. We do have power, and we're already secretly hiding in these spots.
That's a wonderful way to put it. We're all around you.
We are. We're everywhere.
Megyn, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much. This has been great fun. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I really encourage you all to check out Megyn's podcast, The Megyn Kelly Show, which is available in all the usual places. And please recommend it as well. It's a fantastic listen. For those of you in the audience who are not WCM members and who are interested in joining, I direct you to the link on your screen.